very much my brother and PS, Tom, our CS, and my schoolmate, Professor Jogona Dongo, our PS, Dr. Kipto, our PS, James Mohati, other principal secretaries, the team from the National Treasury, all the accounting officers, all the guests in this auditorium. Good morning. Thank you very much, PS Kipto, for a chance to give a few remarks. And before I do that, I want to recognize my colleagues who are here. We have the chairman for the Debt and Privatization Committee in the National Assembly, Tamuliza tafadhali asimame. Mheshimiwa Shurie. We also have the chairperson for the Budget and Appropriations Committee, the vice chairperson, of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, Honorable Mary Emase, who is the MP for Teso South, and the chair for the debt is the MP for Parapara. You can be sure there will always be light notes when there are politicians around, but they are very good colleagues of mine. Dr. Kipto, you have done well to recognize that you lived in this compound, because I was talking to the PS for energy, Alex, and he was indicating that there is a pending bill for electricity for one of the houses in this compound. I am not saying anything, but you are checking. Maybe during the launch of the sector working group, whatever we are launching today, we'll give a proper report to our CS to see what we can do as the National Treasury and as the government to bail out the people who left bills here. We are here to launch the sector working groups. And I remember last year, we did the same exercise, though belatedly, at KICC. And we enumerated the reason why we do this kind of exercise. And I can see around even the spaces that were there then are the same faces we have today. And I am sure everyone who is here understands the role which we are launching today. This goes into furtherance of showing that the budget-making process is a very consultative process. It is a process not just for us as the Budget Committee or the National Treasury, but this is an exercise that incorporates all government officers, and especially accounting officers, and also the public, because it's extremely consultative. So as we come and gather here, of course there will be ceilings that we'll be dealing with, and I hope to make our work much easier. We'll be able to do much of the work in terms of allocation, in terms of sectors, and I'm talking about the 10 sectors, so that we can be able to optimize on the resources that we have. So once we are done with this, just for the sake of the process, we'll be back maybe somewhere else or still in this hall, now to officially launch the working that we are going to undertake from today. And usually at the same day, we'll have the public participation. The members of public will come and give their opinions in regards of the budget making process. And after that, we are going to pass the budget policy statement in the National Assembly that now actually then incorporates the ceilings of the sectors and also the departments. And thereafter, we are going to deal with the estimates, what now we call the budget, which is the estimates that we pass in the National Assembly and which later now become law in terms of the Appropriations Act. And therefore that is the process that we undertake. Here and there we have supplementary estimates because a country is a living being. It is dynamic, and because it is dynamic, circumstances change. And when circumstances change, then we have to look at our budget in what we call supplementary estimates. However, going forward, and I'm sure maybe the CS will be highlighting, we are trying as much as possible not to be very radical in supplementary estimates, so that we only do that which we must do. And we also adhere to the law that we do not exceed 10% of the actual budget as we make the supplementary estimates. And I am sure that is what we are going to adhere going forward. But even at that, it is good that I highlight a few things and allow me to be using the figures of the budget that we are currently undertaking or implementing. That is the budget for financial year 2023-2024. And I'm giving this as an overview of the expectations in terms of even the president, who is our boss, and in terms of where we sit as the representatives of the people. The current budget we are implementing, I am sure some figure changed last minute because we had issues around the housing levy and the housing fund. But the budget that we ended up passing is actually a budget of 3.744 trillion. And out of that, the money that we will be raising as ordinary revenue is around 2.63 trillion Kenya shillings. Then we project, because budgets are projections, to have appropriations in aid of around 347 billion Kenya shillings. And we look forward to having grants of around 42 billion. If you do the math from the 3.744, then our deficit therefore is around 720 billion Kenya shillings approximately. On the other expenditure side, because we are not likely to drastically change, that is why I'm giving these figures, because we already did zero-based last year, and we'll be building up onto that. The recurrent for the national government, I'm now on the expenditure side, is around 1.53 trillion Kenya shillings. It is humongous. The money that will be going into development, national government, is around 807 billion. And when I talk about national government, it is inclusive of the judiciary and parliament. Then after that, there is a growing expenditure line called CFS. Consolidated Fund Services is growing for good intentions because we have allocated 986 billion shillings into CFS. CFS is the payment of interest rates, payment of pensions, and the transfers to our commissions, because the 2010 Constitution envisaged commissions as independent governments. They are not supposed to rely on what I would call the national government per se. That is why their monies and transfers goes into CFS. So that it is statutory, it is obligatory for Treasury to release that money first. And of course, there is now the 385 billion that we take to our counties. Why am I giving this brief? I'm giving this brief because if you check on the revenue side, we project ordinary revenue of just, or actually 2.6 trillion. That calls for a lot of reflection, because we do not want to expand this deficit by way of collecting less. Because the less you collect, then you add up onto the deficit. And I am sure, because we have had interactions with Professor Jogona Dongo and Dr. Kipto, a lot is happening around revenue collection. Revenue collection, which is in triple ways, which is number one, on the physical side of looking at how much we can collect. And the physical side is basically checking on how we can expand the net and how we can recalibrate tax collection. Number two is the administration, and especially around KRA. Tax administration can also be a boost in terms of tax collection and therefore it is important to give it some weight. And that is why there is a lot of sensitization that is happening around KRA to see loopholes, to reduce as much as possible human interaction, because that, of course, goes into adding the revenues that we collect. And as we do that, I've been benefiting a lot by having a professor and a doctor around me as my friends, because I know we are trying to optimize on revenue collection. Because we may keep on increasing interest rate, but you have to find an equilibrium. Many times we think increasing the rate, then it nets in more revenue. But you may increase the rate, then you change behaviors. A person who was to take something that is taxable, they change the root of that behavior, and then you end up losing that entirely. And that is why I'm sure the National Treasury and the KRA, they have been very forthright on looking at the revenue maximizing tax rate, RMTS, where at the equilibrium of tax collection, you look at an optimal, at an optimal level. And possibly that is the reason why even in this budget that we're implementing, for the first time in a long time, there was no much in terms of what you would call sin tax, and especially related to alcohol and related also to cigarettes. Because at some point then you may tax, and then people change behavior, and then the tax rate becomes now counterproductive. And of course in RMTS, the other very critical part is enforcement, and that is the reason why there is already a battalion of over 1,000 who are now undergoing paramilitary training to assist in tax enforcement, because it's also an element of tax administration. The other one is, of course, legal, which we do in Parliament, and also in terms of the finance bill, which we have already done in terms of now the Act, and I'm sure that goes into adding to the basket. But I also want us to zoom in on the expenditure side. I talked about the deficit on this side of the revenue, but that expenditure, deficit has also ramifications on the expenditure side. Why? CFS, to a large extent, is a creation of the deficit. It is the accumulation of the deficit that then adds into the national debt, and it is the national debt that is sovereign that we actually service using the CFS. If you look at the current CFS allocation, it is hopeful. Some people may see the 986 billion shillings, and possibly we may conclude that we are spending a lot of money in terms of debt repayment. On our side, I think that is a very good thing and a very good signal, because what we are trying to do is to actually bring forth and bring forward future obligations. The more debt we clear now, the more we get out of the trap. That is why we are lessing on the side of the deficit. We have climbed down. On the side of CFS, we have climbed up, so that we borrow less in terms of the whole, but we also expend more in terms of burning the whole, so that eventually, ultimately, we may live the dream of having a balanced budget. When we eventually, in future, lessen our budget of debt repayment, then we'll be able to free up these resources to now go to some to our counties, others go to our national government expenditure, and I am sure that is how fiscal prudence should be adhered to, and that is the leadership that we are actually borrowing from our president of fiscal consolidation, borrowing less, paying more, so that we unshackle ourselves. Before I conclude, allow me to say a few things around the circumstances. Because last time when we met, though it was late, we were actually late in terms of statutory dates of budget making process. It was a gloomy morning. That morning was gloomy because the country and circumstances were gloomy also. We were in winter. We were talking about circumstances around famine, around 40 years of the worst drought in 40 years. But today, I think we are more celebratory. We are celebratory because circumstances are much different now, and especially internally. We are no longer now talking about interventions of buying relief food. Now we are talking about allocations so that we are able to manage post-harvest loss. And I think that is a very, very celebratory discussion. The kind of optimism we are seeing in our farms, we are likely to have a bumper harvest. We have already allocated monies in this budget in terms of the post-harvest loss, because we now are no longer talking about intervening to keep the Kenyan people alive. We already have or anticipating a bumper harvest. And what we are looking at now is to incorporate having that harvest now, take care of us now and in the future. But there are also other glaring issues. That is, I started with the celebratory one. Some of the problems now and circumstances we are facing are more external than internal. And number one, it was still the case then, it is still the case now. When the US economy coughs, eventually we get affected. The Federal Reserve, most of the times we look at the tendency of the Federal Reserve and we think it's just news for CNBC and other business outlets. But this is actions that also affect ourselves as economies of developing countries. In the US, they have been trying to work around something they did during the COVID time. People, even Kenyans who have dual citizenship, would receive what was then COVID checks. Then there was a lot of money supply in the US. Money supply elevated the behavior for expenditure. The behavior for expenditure gave room to inflation. Now, to arrest that, the US has been now trying to calm down inflation through the monetary tool of raising the Fed rate. But unfortunately, it is a double-edged sword. They raise the interest rate, but then their internal problems becomes a global menace. Because once the Fed rate raises, an investor who is investing in our NSC sees other better opportunities to invest in the US, and especially in fixed income instruments. Now, when they do that in Kenya, they do that in Zambia, they do that in the other economies, then there is capital flight back to the US. That capital flight affects our currency. It affects our own inflation. And the reason why we see our local currency doing what it is doing, and you look, it is like a chorus and a unison, that the tendency of our local currency, if you read yesterday's newspaper, they were talking about the Tanzanian shilling being at its weakest. This week also I read somewhere in the newspapers, the yen also weakening. Now all this now affects all of us. And I hope maybe going forward, they will change the monetary inclination into raising the Fed rate, because then that frees up the space and then we ease up even at home. So I want to also thank all of us, because the Treasury has done very well in terms of disbursement, and I hope then going forward, Exchequer will always match budget, because now Exchequer is becoming now another route of budget making. We make the budget, but you actually know you have the money once the Exchequer is released. I hope going forward, maybe up to 95%, people can be able to project that the budget that I have actually received, I'm going to get it. Otherwise, nowadays, we make a budget, but the real budget is actually the Exchequer. I don't think that should be the case. Thank you very much. May God bless you. Thank you very much. I went to some small school called Kiapugi in Murang'a. And before I joined, some other people had joined. And those people who had joined before us, They took all the knowledge. They became knowledgeable. They became professors. That is why I am where I am now today, being a mere master and other schoolmates are professors. So now it is my honor to invite my schoolmate, Professor Jogona Dongo, our CS Treasury, to give his remarks and launch these sector working groups.